Sorry Now, Paul Turner Mystery, Book 1. Author, Mark Richard Zubro. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1991. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 4. Saturday morning, Paul Turner woke up to the sound of his older son talking to a friend on the phone. He heard him laugh raucously and then lower his voice. Turner felt no breeze as he glanced out the window. None of the leaves on the old oaks moved the slightest. The heat of another cloyingly humid day surrounded him. One of these years, he wanted to air condition his place. He took a shower and dressed in faded jeans and a sleeveless t-shirt with the University of Illinois Chicago campus logo on the front. He wanted to get the morning chores done as quickly as possible. He had agreed to meet Fenwick at 1 to re-question the Reverend and try to pick up any details on the case. He might even give the Kankakee and the Schaumburg police a call to check on what Ian had told him the night before. First, he had domestic chores to attend to. He started a load of wash, supervised Brian as the trash got taken out, refereed a brief argument between the boys. Jeff wanted to wear one of Brian's rock group t-shirts. Vacuuming, floor scrubbing, and bathroom cleaning all got done amid various grumblings, not all of which came from the two younger members of the household. Tranquility finally reigning in the house, he and Brian walked out to the garage. Paul had helped Brian buy an old car. Brian had insisted on a used Trans Am, even though Paul had told him they'd spend most of their time fixing it. In the 6 months since they had bought it, they had spent most Saturday mornings in the garage fixing it, or taking it to the local mechanic so he could work on it. Early on, Paul had installed a heater in the garage so they could work on it through the winter. He guessed that if you totaled up the amount of time the car had run without a problem, it would probably add up to less than a full week. An hour into the work, Paul squirmed out from under the car, followed by his grease-encrusted son. "We've tried everything else. It's got to be the starter switch," Turner said. Brian nodded. "Can we get it today? Can we get it put in before you have to go to work?" "I don't remember saying you could use the car tonight." "Dad, this is too important to tease about. Let's go to Vargas's now." He nudged his dad. "You'll get a chance to talk to Ben." "Talking to Ben, and him talking to me, does not mean he is gay and wants a date. Dad, I know how he looks at you. Even I know he's interested." Paul shot out a hand to grab his son. Brian wasn't quick enough to dodge away. They wrestled briefly, grinning at each other. Finally, Brian slipped away. Turner panted slightly, eyeing his son askance. "You're getting too big to wrestle with, and how come you know so much about who I need to date?" "One, you're getting old, and two, I go on dates and you don't. It works pretty much the same with girls, Dad." Paul smiled at his son. "I guess I remember." "That was so long ago," Brian said. "You want the car fixed, or not?" Paul said. Paul had told Brian about his sexual orientation when the boy was 8 years old. He didn't think Brian understood it completely then, but he was glad he had told him at that age. Early on, he'd been able to resolve questions and confusions about a father who was different, and Paul's openness and honesty over this issue led the two of them to develop a closer relationship than most fathers and sons. He had told Jeff last year, and so far the results had been the same. They walked the half-block to Vargas's auto parts store. The Saturday morning crowd milled around the pumps in front, the service bays in back, and the parts counter in the middle. Ben Vargas smiled when he saw them, finished with a customer, and came over to talk. Turner observed more closely than usual Vargas's body and mannerisms. They'd gone through grade school and high school together. He knew Ben had gone away to college, and he'd heard he was living in California. His boyhood friend had returned several months ago, when old Mr. Vargas retired and left the business to his son. Ben stood an inch or two taller than Paul. He wouldn't be called handsome, but some might call him rugged. His hair hung a trifle longer than was usual in the neighborhood. His white shirt clung to broad shoulders and tapered into a pair of faded jeans that Paul admitted he noticed every time he came in. He looked up from the crotch of them now and saw Ben's eyes on his. They discussed auto parts, Brian's foolishness in buying the Trans Am, old Mr. Vargas now living in Florida, all while Ben let his help wait on other customers. They promised to get together for a cup of coffee at some indeterminate time in the future. They made almost the same promise to each other every time they spoke. At 1 that afternoon, Turner made his way through the building, humidity and 90-degree temperature. Wilmer and his stench did not greet him at the station door. Maybe he took Saturdays off, Turner thought, though Wilmer always seemed to be around. First he called Sam Franklin in the crime lab. Sam said, "They used a .38 double-action revolver with a silencer on the end. Standard issue cop gun in this city, except for the last part. Took us 3 hours to find the bullet in the sand. Lucky it was in one piece. Not much else to tell you. Almost seems like a mob execution." They talked a while longer, but Franklin had little other information. Turner thanked him and hung up. He called California to ask about Jason Thurman. He tried the sergeant he talked to the day before, but Sergeant Dooley was not available. It took 15 minutes worth of transfers to get her home phone number. He had to repeat his name, rank, and reason for calling 3 times. He suspected that in that time someone called Chicago to check on his validity. He called her home and the line was busy. Fenwick came in as he finished the call. They forced their way through the humidity to the car and drove to the Oak Street Arms. They ran into an ethnic parade moving down Michigan Avenue. Even with the police trying to smooth their way through the streets, it took 20 minutes for a 5-minute drive. Sweat drenched both of them as they entered the air-conditioned bliss of the hotel. Upstairs, Donald McElrath said, "What do you want to see my father about?" "We'll tell him that," Fenwick said. "You'll tell me." The sun stood between them and further access to the suite. Turner sighed. Fenwick was good at this sort of thing. He mixed the right amount of menace and innocence as he said, "Fine. We'll get warrants, arrest you and the Reverend as material witnesses, and talk to both of you down at the station. I'm sure we could notify the press on our way." Johnson walked in at that moment carrying a sheaf of papers. Turner noted Johnson's ashen look and the fact that the paper shook in hands that trembled. Turner told him they needed to see the Reverend. Johnson's voice didn't rise above a whisper. "He's free." "What's going on?" Donald asked. "I told him the truth," Johnson said. "About what?" the 35-year-old son asked. "Everything," Johnson said. "Which way?" Fenwick asked Johnson. The older man nodded toward a doorway on the left, from which he'd emerged moments earlier. Donald followed Fenwick and Turner in the room. The Reverend Mucklerath knelt at the side of his bed, his elbows resting on the coverlet. Mucklerath wore a severe black suit and a tie to match. He gazed up at the three of them, finally his Old Testament visage fixed on Turner. Turner said, "Reverend," the man responded by rising slowly to his feet. Instead of turning to the police, he pointed a gnarled finger at his son. "Get out." Turner thought he sounded like Charlton Heston, doing his best God imitation. Donald Mucklerath said, "What's going on, Dad?" "You knew, didn't you?" the Reverend said. "Don't try to deny it. Johnson has told me all about himself, what you knew, and what you yourself are guilty of. Now get out. I will deal with you later." Donald swayed back and forth as if he might faint, opened and closed his mouth as if trying to speak. Mrs. Mucklerath hurried into the room. "I just talked to Johnson." She spotted the police and abruptly stopped speaking. She eyed them all coldly. The Reverend said to his wife, "I need to talk to Donald at a more appropriate time. Could you—" She marched over to Donald and said to him in what Turner thought was a surprisingly gentle voice, "Come with me, please, Donald." They left. Mucklerath walked slowly to a cushioned chair next to the window. Fenwick and Turner followed him and sat on a small couch. Turner watched his face carefully. He saw furrowed lines around the mouth and eyes, red spots on the high cheekbones, and a gleam of sweat on the upper lip. The man breathed deeply for several minutes. He stared out the window toward the high-rise next door and spoke without turning to them. "Yesterday morning, I knew God was with me. He'd granted me all the happiness he could give to a human, a beautiful family, a loving wife, a calling that I find deeply satisfying, and an organization committed to God's work." He reached out and tapped the glass with his knuckles. "The Lord is testing me. I shouldn't wonder. Why me? He tests all according to our ability to bear the weight of the world. Turner asked, Reverend Mucklerath, where did you go late Thursday night and early Friday morning? Mucklerath still didn't look at them. He said, I have no need to answer that question. It has nothing to do with what happened to... He paused and finished. To Christina. We need to know, Reverend, Fenwick said. You think you do, but you don't, the minister said. He turned to them with a wan smile on his face. I'm going to tell you a little story. He held up a hand to forestall any protests they might make. In telling the story, all of your questions will be answered. He moved his chair so it faced the two of them. Backlit by the window light, his face in shade, the Reverend placed his hands palm up on his legs and began to speak in a low voice. I imagine you think I'm a fraud like all these other television preachers. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I have no mistresses, no extramarital affairs. I have no involvement in drugs. The books of all my organizations are open to anyone's inspection. I'm different from all the other preachers. I believe, and I am not out to cheat those who believe. I do not live in a palace. Many of my fellow preachers hate me for my honesty and openness. Many are jealous of my success. Some have been trying to be elected to political office or to influence the process of legislation the way I have. They all failed. I have succeeded. Jealousy is an ugly thing. I have flaws. I trust the people around me to a fault. I believe as God has chosen me, so has He chosen them. I should pay more attention to those around me. That Dr. Johnson consorted with woman, not his wife, distresses me. It seems my son conspired with him, and even at times paid for the service of women. Beyond this, I now know my son used his position in the organization to extort enormous sums of money from people who believed in me. You can ask him later. It seems many people were willing to pay him because they thought he could influence me. None of this money went through my organization. You will need to check his personal accounts. You see how honest I'm being. My own son, a liar and cheat. Perhaps he didn't do something strictly illegal, but what he did was morally reprehensible. I'm afraid he may have done more that Johnson didn't know about. I have other flaws. One of them is that I don't sleep well at night, especially when in a speaking tour. The Lord speaks to me at those times. I awake, dress, and leave. I thought my movements a secret. I was wrong. I go to the mission we have set up in each city for the poor and homeless. I go there to the tiny chapels that we build in each shelter. I go there and I pray. Afterward, I help out as best I can. I also talk to the faithful on duty. I speak with those who, like myself, cannot sleep and have come to us for serenity. One time, I delivered a baby. Sometimes, I help wash up the dishes, pots and pans from the suppers we give. I've done lice-infested laundry. I've swept. I do whatever needs to be done. We'll have to check with your mission here, Turner said quietly. Of course. I've had no time to call them, to warn them, although I would hope they would speak honestly with you, no matter what. Your first wife said you hid a lot of money. The records of the divorce are open. You are welcome to hunt through them. After talking to the Reverend, they interviewed the shaken Donald, who smelled suspiciously like bourbon, an emotional basket case. He was unable to give them any useful information about himself or his father. In the car, Fenwick said, The Reverend is a hypocritical, lying bastard. The guy is a double fuck if I ever met one. I think he told us the truth, Turner said calmly. Fenwick ignored the comment and said, And the rest of the family is for shit. No doubt about that, Turner said, then added, They don't seem to be exceptionally broken up about Christina's death, except the Reverend. You believe he doesn't know what the killers meant when they say, sorry now, aren't you? Turner reflected a minute. No, I don't think he knows it, at least not consciously. He's caught up with God and his cause. If we could get him down to the human level, we could possibly get something, but I doubt it. They drove to the address the Reverend gave them at the Mission of Eternal Salvation on West Madison Street. They found numerous workers eager to confirm the Reverend Mucklerath's presence late Thursday and early Friday. As they checked on the mission worker's story, they spent some time afterward finding the cop on the beat, who gave them the names of a few of the regulars at the mission. After a half-hour search, they found one of the homeless lounging on a bench outside the Chicago Police Academy on Jackson. His name was Darren Brodasinski. He claimed to have talked to the Reverend around 2 in the morning. When he entered the mission, Fenwick said as they drove back to the station, "Maybe Mucklewrath told the truth. Maybe he really doesn't know and doesn't have anything to do with the murder. If he doesn't, then that crowd around him sure must know something," Turner said. "And they haven't told us shit. It sure feels like they're hiding something. I'm going to try California again. I want to know about the campaign manager and the other preachers around the country." It was nearly 4 when they pulled up at the station. It had rained briefly while they were in the mission, but instead of washing the atmosphere clean with fresh, cool air, it had added to the mugginess. Turner sat in his shirt sleeves and turned the fan on full blast. At their desk, Roosevelt and Wilson were each interviewing a white male. From listening, Turner thought they might have finally arrested the men in a series of robberies that had plagued the near north side. 2 men had made a science of attacking people using outdoor banking machines from the Chicago River to Rogers Park. Roosevelt passed by Fenwick's and Turner's desk on the way to the small kitchen storage room they had. "Finally catch the bank guys?" Fenwick asked. "Yeah, they tried a place at Michigan and Ontario. They got caught in traffic and their car overheated," Roosevelt said. "I never thought I'd be grateful to one of the parades down in Michigan Avenue for making my life easier." By the time he came back a minute later carrying a can of grape soda, Turner was already on the phone to California, and this time he caught Sergeant Dooley at home. He asked about the campaign manager, Jason Thurman. She said, "A nice guy, not hard to work with. Of the whole crowd, he was the most accessible. It wasn't surprising he quit. A lot of bad feeling when he left. Not against the Reverend, or at least none that he mentioned. It was pretty well known that his beef was with Mrs. Mucklewrath and the son. For all their supposed expertise, they're really political amateurs. I think it drove him nuts, and the Reverend believes in family and trusting them. I can't see Thurman being angry enough to murder the kid, and I certainly can't see any other motivation." That was one thing that was driving Turner nuts in the investigation. So far, no one in the inner circle had a reason to murder Christina. The other problem was that outside the organization, there could be millions of Mucklewrath haters and just plain nutcases who could have done it. How about other preachers out there? Do any of them have a special hate for Mucklewrath? Turner asked Dooley. That's tougher. You'd have to be able to check nationwide out here. I don't remember anyone being especially nice or nasty. I think those guys are a pretty independent lot. One of them tried to get a national conference of preachers going, but then they had all those scandals and everybody bailed out. Turner glanced at the time, Saturday at 5 o'clock. Nearly 33 hours since the murder, and they didn't have a lot of clues. Feeling a little foolish, Turner put in a call to Schomburg. The guy who answered growled unpleasantly, but talked to him, barely checking his identification and gruff, terse words. He told Turner they didn't consider the case anything significant, beyond the obvious that some people ate something and got sick. Turner was inclined to agree. He got almost the same reaction from his call to Kankakee. Fenwick brought over the lab paperwork. It didn't tell them any more than they already knew. The crime lab had found nothing other than the bullet to indicate who might have done the killing. Turner and Fenwick spent an hour going over the reports from the cops, who'd interviewed the people in the high-rises facing Oak Street Beach. They still had numerous callbacks to make, but so far, they turned up zip, not even a glimmer. At 7, they gave it up. Spending all of Saturday night in frustration wouldn't help. Block the case sergeant on duty came through and told them to go home. At the admitting desk downstairs, Charlie Grimwald motioned for Turner to join him. Grimwald said, "Did you hear the news?" Turner shook his head. Normally, Charlie liked to talk, and usually Turner didn't mind giving him some time, but he was in a hurry. Grimwald said, "They found an old guy in the river this afternoon near Roosevelt Road." "Who was it?" Turner asked. "They aren't sure, but from the description, I think it might have been Wilmer. They said they found some little toy cars in his pocket. You know, the metal kind they've got for your kids." Turner gapped at him. You okay? Grimwald asked. Turner mumbled a yeah and asked that Grimwald be sure to let him know when they got a positive identification and get him any other information. Turner told him he would call sometime on Sunday. Paul planned to meet Ian at the ticket booth at the west end of Navy Pier. He parked near Olive Park and walked the half block over, staring up at the expanse of Lake Point Towers. He adjusted his collar and bow tie for the 100th time. Brian and Jeff had teased him about going out. Ian had been trying to get him attached. Turner felt, if it happened, fine. He'd dated some nice guys over the years, but none seriously. In a long while, he wouldn't go out of his way, but he wouldn't reject somebody interesting out of hand. He had 2 boys to rear and a hectic job, enough for anyone. A hand brushed his arm. A throaty voice said, "Hello, handsome." Paul turned to see his friend attired in a similar tuxedo, but with a Mickey Mouse motif dress shirt and bow tie. "I like the understated look," Paul said. "People are all looking at you, my friend. You are fresh meat, and you are gorgeous. You should have let me put you up for auction. You would have grabbed the highest bids for the night." Paul found himself blushing for the first time since 2nd grade, when Monica Planifer had accused him of trying to look under her dress. Sister Suzanne had made him stand up in front of the whole class and apologize. "I'm not looking for a husband, and I don't want to be auctioned off," Paul said. "Why don't you have them bid on your more famous columns?" "This is supposed to make money," Ian said. He took his friend's arm and propelled him through the gate and along the pier. "There's enough husband material out here for any man to find somebody. Even the most responsible parent in the city might find Mr. Right." Numerous excursion boats and a few private yachts were berthed along the pier. Their destination was the boat, Heart of Michigan, the largest excursion boat in the harbor. It had 4 levels. The top, open to the air, was the smallest. The 2nd and 3rd levels actually combined to surround a small stage on which were staged minor musical productions. From the 3rd level, one could walk onto an open space on the stern of the ship. The 4th level was completely enclosed. The interior of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th levels contained tables set for elegant dining in a cruise ship motif. They walked up a gangplank to be greeted by smiling young men saying, "Welcome aboard," and giving out cards that gave them a number by which they would be recognized if they chose to bid on one of the bachelors. Mobs of elegantly dressed men thronged the interior of the 2nd and 3rd decks. Paul Turner dated and spent enough time in gay bars to recognize the stares of interest he got. Comfortable with people he knew, yet relatively shy with strangers, he wasn't all that thrilled about telling someone what he did. Saying he was a cop could lead to inappropriate fantasies or immediate huffy disinterest on the part of potential dates. Once in a while, the newly acquainted became belligerent, one of the hazards of being a cop. One of his wife, Gail's secrets had been the ability to talk to a handsome, athletic teenage boy and make him comfortable in social situations. He thought at 18 that the sex part would grow as they got to know each other. He'd been woefully ignorant and had put down his lack of performance expertise to lack of experience, not lack of interest. As the years had passed, he'd realized it had been the later and not the former. He and Ian squeezed to the bar and managed to grab a couple of beers. They left the air-conditioned interior and made their way to the top deck. Here, the cool lake made their formal tuxes less uncomfortable. The heat of the day was at least bearable. A group of men stood arguing animatedly in the stern. Ian waved to them and walked forward. Paul followed. 5 of them greeted Ian eagerly, demanding to know his opinion of the chances of electing a gay or lesbian candidate to the state senate. Ian introduced Paul. He caught most of their names, but remembered one, a man with golden hair, short on the sides but hanging to his collar. In the back, stood slightly apart. Ian introduced him as Dr. George Manfred. Paul guessed him to be in his early 30s. He might have been 5'6" or 7. Paul saw bright blue eyes and smooth tan skin. The doctor caught his look and smiled at him. Beautiful even teeth. The others switched topics to the Reverend Mucklewrath and the murderer. The discussion became quite heated. Finally, one of them, Paul thought he remembered his name as Ty, said, "I wish they'd killed him. I feel sorry for the daughter, but that shit-for-brains hate-monger deserves everything rotten that could happen to him. They should have killed him." Most of the men nodded agreement. One of the others said, "I can think of a whole list of other people who it'd be great to get rid of. Think of it, a world without homophobes." Paul listened, not contributing. Fortunately, Ian had not introduced him as a cop. He didn't want to have to listen to their pet theories if they found out he was assigned to solve the murder. He felt out of place at moments like this. Briefly, he wished he hadn't come. When he turned into them again, they'd gotten onto the topic of Chicago politics. He felt his elbow brushed gently. Dr. Manfred smiled up at him. Paul had noticed him standing on the other side of the circle, also not contributing to the conversation. Minutes later, Paul found himself at the railing, deep in conversation. He could never remember what George Manfred first said to him. After 15 minutes, he realized he hadn't been this comfortable since the first days with Gail. He found out George was 32 years old, born in southern Illinois. He had gone to college and medical school, and then completed his residency at Chicago City Hospital. He now devoted his practice to people with AIDS, especially those gay men too poor to afford decent care. The doctor didn't comment when Paul told him he was a cop. Turner found himself talking about his sons, his hopes and dreams for them. Jess being born with Spina Bifidia and Gail's death. Manfred sympathized quietly, then asked, "Did she know you were gay?" "I'm not sure." "I did. Being gay would have put an end to the marriage eventually, more because Gail had a right to be sexually fulfilled. I'd begun to doubt my sexuality before Gail's pregnancy with Jeff. Then when he was born with Spina Bifidia and she died," he drew a deep breath, and then continued, "I'd known Ian. He helped a lot. We became lovers. He's a good man. We broke up, but he's still my best friend." The boat cruised south on the lake with the Chicago skyline on their right. Paul had never seen the city he grew up in so spectacularly displayed. The lights of the skyscrapers soared above the twirling mass of cars rushing along Lakeshore Drive. "It's so beautiful," he said, and felt like a little kid. George put his arms on Paul's shoulder, let it linger. Eventually, the doctor talked about his boyhood in a small town. He talked about trudging to a one-room schoolhouse that had only 22 other kids. He talked about isolation and feeling different. Manfred didn't hear the word gay until he was in his senior year of high school. He spoke of the relief of escape of going to college and medical school in St. Louis. He mentioned how seldom he dated because of his intensive studies in school and his exhausting routine now. Paul didn't know if he wanted a major involvement at this point in his life, but on first impression, George Manfred was certainly someone he'd like to get to know. As Ian and Paul walked down the gangway, the reporter pumped him for information about George. "Is it a relationship? Are you going out with him?" "He's a great guy. He's got a phenomenal reputation in the community. He could step into any meeting of warring factions, and in minutes he's got them working together. I've seen him step in between two hissing queens and restore calm almost instantly. He's got those dreamy good looks and a personality to die for. Are you in love?" "We exchanged phone numbers," Paul said. "That's absolutely boring," Ian said. "Are you going to call him?" he demanded. "I don't know. Maybe. Let's see if he calls me." "Paul, nowhere is it written that the other guy has to call you first. You could call him." "I am a cop with 2 kids, one of whom requires more than a moderate amount of parental care." Ian grabbed him, turned him around, and put his nose an inch away from Paul's. "I have heard you say that so many times. What bullshit! He's nice. He's good looking. He's got a career. Rumor has it he's independently wealthy. What more do you want?" Paul shrugged off Ian's grip. "I didn't say I wanted more. I didn't say I wouldn't call him. I didn't notice you waltzing off with Mr. Wright." "At this point, I'll settle for Mr. Fairly Adequate," Ian said. On Sunday morning, Paul took his two boys to Sunday Mass. They walked the 3 blocks to St. Felicitas. Paul thought it hypocritical of a gay man to attend any kind of religious services, the churches having abandoned gay people long before. Paul thought God might have, but he felt it was right for his boys. A year or so ago, Brian declared he wasn't going anymore. Paul told him that when he graduated from high school, he could make a choice about church attendance. Until then, he had to attend, occasionally. If Jeff felt the walk would be too much, they would push him in a wheelchair. In rain or winter, Paul drove them to the Mass. He and Jeff spent the afternoon at Brian's baseball game. They sat in the stands in the shade of an ancient oak that had survived years of neighborhood abuse. Brian pitched and played first base for the St. Felicitas high school team. Paul couldn't often make his son's games, but he got to as many as he could. Jeff's spina bifidia meant that at birth his spinal cord and nerves protruded in a sac from his back near the bottom of his spine. He was born with bladder and bowel dysfunction and paralysis of his legs. Paul felt, and the doctors concurred, that it was better for Jeff to be treated as much like a normal child as possible. It was too easy for a parent, in guilt or remorse, to pamper, spoil, or overprotect a kid. Paul had seen the results when he'd gone on field trips with Jeff's classes. Before Jeff had been mainstreamed into a regular classroom in 2nd grade, many of the kids acted out, put on a show, or simply grossly manipulated parents too befuddled to cope. Not spoiling Jeff had been hard at first. Feeling sorry and monumentally guilty overwhelmed many parents of these kids. Turner's own common sense, along with Mrs. Tolucci's realism, had gotten him over that. They'd been fortunate the past 2 years. Jeff had gone to the yearly doctor's appointments and been reported in good health. Paul was glad for this, but knew he had to be continually watchful. Children with spina bifidia could require emergency hospitalization, especially if the shunt placed in their head to drain fluid became clogged or had other problems. No amount of checkups or parental watchfulness could prevent such an occurrence. Paul was enjoying the game and watching Brian run gracefully in good health. He felt pride in Brian's natural ability. Having some of the same musculature as Brian enabled his younger son to master physical tasks far sooner than others with the same defect. Paul enjoyed sitting next to Jeff, observing the younger boy's adulation of his older brother, and evident joy when Brian made a good play. Of course, Paul needed to take Jeff to the washroom so the boy could perform his ritual of urination. Jeff didn't complain, and Paul brought him back to the stands after the briefest of pauses. He talked to neighbors and friends. Kids stopped by to talk to Jeff. Brian had permission to go out with his buddies after the game, but since he had school the next day, he had to be in by 8 to study for his final exams. Next week, Turner called the station when he got in from the game to see if there had been any developments in the Mucklerath case. Nothing. He asked about Wilmer, but Wilson and Roosevelt, who had the case, weren't in. Paul spent the evening playing checkers with Jeff and reading with him. He even found some time to work on household tasks that got put off too often. He managed to rebolt the handholds in Jeff's bathroom in less than an hour. The phone rang at 9. Paul found himself wishing it would be George Manfred. Instead, a voice he didn't recognize said, "We're watching you, cop. You'd make a good target on the beach, and your kid's an even better one." A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.